Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Justice and Human Rights Talk series in Northern Justice Watch. We have a distinguished guest today. I'm Dr. Davut Akca, Assistant Professor in Lakehead University. Also, I'm volunteering in Northern Justice Watch as a member of the Justice and Accountability team. And we also have Ruweida today. Ruweida, can you introduce yourself?
Yep. Hello. My name is Ruweida Dos. I'm part of the communications team in Northern Justice Watch. I'll be helping with this interview today.
Great. So we have a distinguished guest today, as I said, Sarah Teich. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to our talk.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So thanks for accepting our invitation. I will briefly introduce Sarah. Sarah Teich is an international human rights lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. She is one of the co-founders of Human Rights Action Group, and she is working with a variety of different victim groups, and she's an international law practitioner, as I said, and she is also a senior fellow at McDonald Laurier Institute. Yeah, senior fellow at the McDonald Laurier Institute. This is just a brief introduction of Sarah. Now in this talk today, we will talk about a recent report published by Human Rights Action Group, and Sarah Teich was one of the three authors of that report. And so we will ask about that report. First of all, Sarah, I want to ask you about transnational repression. This report is on transnational repression and its implications in Canada, and you gave a lot of information on case studies, specific countries, and you gave a list of recommendations to be able to fight against transnational repression. But we want to know first what transnational repression means. Can you just give us some information about that?
Sure. Actually, before I get into that, I just want to add one more thing about the report itself, because I want to make sure everyone who deserves credit gets credit. It was a co-publication between Human Rights Action Group, which is an organization that David Matas and I co-founded earlier this year, and Council for Secure Canada. So those are the two publishing organizations. And then the other two authors are David Matas and Hannah Taylor. So just want to make sure, again, that, everyone who deserves credit gets some credit. And then, yes, in terms of transnational repression, one of the recommendations we come to is that there needs to be a universally accepted, as much as that's possible, definition of this phenomenon, because that currently doesn't exist. And what we see is the terms transnational repression, foreign interference, foreign influence, transnational authoritarianism sort of used interchangeably. Essentially, what all of these mean, at least the definition we sort of use in our report, is it's this phenomenon where authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, they reach outside of the borders of their country to repress diaspora community members of nationals of that country that have fled to other countries, as well as their allies, journalists, lawyers, whoever that may be. And another element of this is that, one sort of way that we've seen the definitions be used in different ways is transnational repression is often referred to acts like that go after individuals, whereas foreign interference is acts like that go after institutions. So like what we saw with the Chinese government trying to interfere with the Canadian elections.
Mm-hmm. So it comes as a set of activities of these authoritarian governments. So foreign interference and transnational repression goes hand in hand, as we see from your great report. And thanks for reminding that you published that with Secure Canada. And we will share the link of the report on our website with this podcast, with this talk, and so that our listeners will be able to see that report in more details. So, what made you to do that research and write that kind of report? What is the reason behind? What is the rationale behind writing such a report on that important issue?
Great question. I've, along with David, who's my law partner, we work with a number of different communities. We work with Uyghurs very closely, Tigrayans, Tamils, Turkish people that have been victimized by the Erdogan regime. We work with a whole host of communities, mostly representing community organizations. And what we try to do wherever possible is when there's a phenomenon that affects everyone, we like to go after that phenomenon in a sort of systemic way, because that serves every community that we work for, essentially. So, victims of torture is sort of one such phenomenon. Transnational repression is another. And we see this, as I said, it's all authoritarian regimes essentially engage in this tactic. So we thought that made it a really important, phenomenon to go into in detail.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. So in your report, we see that you mentioned, and you already mentioned some of the names of those authoritarian regimes, and they conduct these lots of different variety of different transnational repression activities. And we want to know more about these, like the tactics and the strategies. Actually, the phenomenon, the transnational repression seems like a bit a new thing, new phenomenon, but the tactics and strategies are something we know. But the thing that makes it new is maybe we are now looking at it in more detail. We know that Freedom House has a report, they have a database on this issue. The Orion Policy Institute recently published a report on that. And around the same time, this report from Human Rights Action Group and Secure Canada came forward. So can you elaborate on those tactics and strategies?
Sure. So, we go into it in great detail in the report. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to read the full report. There are essentially 4 categories. The first one is direct. That includes like assaults against diaspora community members, harassment, intimidation. Then we have sort of the long distance threats like coercion by proxy and mobility controls. We also have co-opting other countries, and that's like Interpol abuse, which we see a lot of. And then beyond that, we have, the attacks on institutions. So attacks on government institutions. We saw with MP Michael Chong in Canada recently that he was the subject of an intimidation campaign and threats and surveillance. And then we have attacks on media, attacks on academic institutions. So there's a whole host of ways that transnational oppression comes about. And it's one thing I want to flag as well is it's very much a growing phenomenon. And I think, part of the reason that this is getting growing attention is that it's growing, and B, these countries are beginning to target more broadly, not just community members, but allies. I myself was hacked by the Chinese government in 2021. David Matus, again, one of the co-authors, an event he attended in Europe for the Iranian diaspora community, which was hosting not just diaspora community members, had a bombing attempt thwarted. So as more and more people are becoming impacted by this, the interest in it from an academic perspective is seeming to grow as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of a broad topic there, I realize.
Yeah, that's a broad topic and lots of different tactics and strategies. The whole list can be found in your report, in other reports as well. You mentioned the impact on communities, but there is the impact on the countries itself. Like speaking about Canada, its sovereignty, for example, or like the democracy, trust in the government. What can we say about those things, like the impact of the government, the Canadian society as a whole, not just the diaspora communities?
Right. I mean, it's obviously related. It's all the same phenomenon, but it's really a problem. And I think this is also what Canada has been focusing on, right? With this, the appointment of this former judge to lead an inquiry. It's really will be focused on election interference. And that's a very serious threat to sovereignty, because when you have rogue regimes halfway around the world influencing Canadian elections, it's really quite a big deal, and it's absolutely a breach of sovereignty, as well as numerous other international and domestic laws.
Mm-hmm. I believe Ruwaida has some questions about what can be done about this, like the prevention side of it. But before we move on to that prevention side, maybe can we talk a little bit about the silencing effect of transnational repression? Like Human Rights Action Group is a international law organization, And Northern Justice Watch, we are a human rights organization, and we are trying to be the voice of victims, trying to be the voices of diaspora communities, and provide some legal support, some victim support, other psychological supports to these groups. And there is these organizations are some groups that try to help these people, but the silencing effect of transnational repression also affect these organizations like us, Human Rights Action Group, Northern Justice Watch, and other people who are trying to help these people. What can we say about this silencing effect?
Right. There's definitely that effect. I would say less on us, at least at Human Rights Action Group. I think the best way to combat that effect is to have a strong grasp of the law. And I say that a little bit biased as a lawyer. I think the law solves a lot of things, but we understand that we're within our rights to do this kind of work. And so that makes it easier to say, no, we're not going to be silenced. But certainly community members that maybe don't have that kind of knowledge, that specific knowledge, if they're experiencing a lot of this stuff, the harassment, the intimidation, threats, especially if those who have community members back home, which is obviously not something that David and I have. We don't have family members back in authoritarian regimes. There's the element of this where authoritarian regimes will threaten to harm those family members, and that puts folks in Canada in a really difficult position. You can keep speaking up, but then potentially your family members bear the brunt of it. And a lot of people may not realize that this kind of threatening is, against the law. And, to be fair, there's not necessarily that much that can be done about that when the perpetrator is halfway around the world, but it's really a problem. Yes. I don't know if that made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. I think Ruwaida has a question about that, to elaborate more on that as well.
Yes, we were meaning to look at it from a much smaller scope. So we had another question: how can individuals or communities and organizations like ours contribute to the efforts, in combating transnational repression and foreign interference in Canada, especially? Would you have any recommendations in terms of what we can do as smaller communities?
Yes, I think, joining us in pushing the government of Canada to adopt some or ideally all of our recommendations, that would be really helpful because, as I said, these actions are against the law. They are, but there's not enough, the Canada's toolkit to combat that is not strong enough. And so, for example, we have the Security of Information Act, which is probably the closest thing we have in terms of a specific legislation to combat these types of incidents. But the offenses that it prescribes are quite narrow in a lot of respects. So that act can and should be amended. There should be a hotline that victims of transnational repression can call. And maybe one element of this that civil society organizations can really help with is offering to the government to not just pushing them to establish that, but actually offering to help with language capabilities of that hotline, getting the information out there to the various diaspora community groups. So there may be a room for also a private-public collaboration on some of these recommendations.
Thank you. Yes, I do remember actually reading about 12-point code of conduct for universities and colleges. I thank you for that. And another question we had, this is more direct to our cause and what we do as Northern Justice Watch. So how can the recommendations in your report directly support organizations like Northern Justice Watch and the ones that you're also collaborating with, that are also committed to fighting crimes against humanity and seeking justice, like ours for the victims of atrocity crimes? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, well, I think sort of it goes back to my previous point where we can all be working together to advocate for some of these recommendations to be implemented. And I think there is this really strong role that Northern Justice Watch can play in terms of getting information out there, particularly to the Turkish community, but to other communities as well that you may be working with. Turkish language capabilities as well, really collaborating with the government and trying to get, a stronger toolkit essentially to combat some of these incidents. And then also even, I guess even in the absence of a government hotline, perhaps Northern Justice Watch could position itself as an organization that victims can go to. when they've been encountering some of these issues. I think there's many gaps because the government of Canada hasn't done quite enough to combat this, that, maybe civil society and at least in the short term can fill that gap.
Thank you.
I think when filling that gap is another part is awareness, like how aware is the general Canadian society about this problem? Like we're talking about foreign interference in general, but specific impacts on the victims, the diaspora communities, and this silencing effect that we talked about. And the reports like the Human Rights Action Group published help us to make it more clear to people, but I think there needs to be some efforts to make it more visible, right? So the awareness, how can we promote that awareness more?
Great question. And you're right. And, the report that we came out with is not intended to raise awareness sort of broadly, because maybe a little bit as an offshoot, but the general public is not going to read 200 pages of analysis on this. So I think, putting the information in sort of more palatable pieces, whether that's, a series of opinion pieces, talking to the media, social media campaign. I think that's sort of it's not something we've done, but it's something that I agree should be done to raise awareness of this, because especially, within diaspora communities as well, they may not know what to do, but certainly beyond diaspora communities, not enough people know that this is going on.
Mm-hmm. I hope this podcast and I hope this talk and further social media posts that we will prepare about this will help us create more awareness on this issue. And thanks again for all the information that you gave, Sarah. That was a great talk. Ruwaida, do you have any other question?
I would maybe ask, would you be able to go in more detail about 12-point code of conduct? That's what caught most of my attention. That's why I'm more focused on it. Sure. Would you be able to go in more detail about it? Would that
Sure.
be okay?
So the 12-point code of conduct is from Human Rights Watch, and that was specifically aimed at combating the Chinese government's interference. I believe it was specifically focused on campuses, university campuses, where Confucius societies operate freely, and they're sort of considered in a way the long arm of the Chinese state, and sort of other issues on campus. And one of our I think it was 37 recommendations was that Canada adopt that code of conduct and in an expanded way to other communities as well, because of course it's not just China that engages in transnational repression. So that's sort of that piece. I think beyond that, if I may, the recommendations that I think are sort of easy, at least first steps for the government to do, are the victim support. So providing a physical, psychological, financial support to victim communities, I think, is something that, it shouldn't take new legislation. It can just be a policy. There are several victims funds in the Canadian government. There's one federally and many provincially, but because of the various criteria and exclusionary criteria, they're not going to apply to many of these incidents. So I think creating a specialized fund would be really important when you have transnational repression. If someone's device is hacked, for example, that person will need to get a new phone, a new laptop. The costs add up. And especially when you're talking about newcomers to Canada, many of whom may have come here as refugees, who had to leave a lot of their wealth and status behind, that's quite a large, that can be quite a large expenditure to have to buy entirely new devices. And then psychological support is really important, because again, it's just further traumatizing individuals that potentially are already quite traumatized, having to escape authoritarian regime to come to Canada. So I think that support for victims is really important. Another piece that I think would be relatively easy for Canada to do is to criminalize refugee espionage. There's a precedent that's been set. They've done that in places in Europe. And that would make it very clear that it's a criminal offense for someone to come in and try to harass diaspora community members. So there are a lot of recommendations, but those are probably my personal favorites, because I think they're low-hanging fruit, especially in terms of victim support. And I think those are really important. They all are, but those are my tops.
Seems like there are lots of things to be done. There's a huge list of tasks on communities, on organizations and government. So I think, and we are on the right path as these organizations, and we have a great partnership with Human Rights Action Group as Northern Justice Watch. And these partnerships and these kinds of efforts, I hope will create more awareness, and these recommendations will not fall in deaf ears, and then they will be implemented in policies and practices, hopefully. And is there anything else, Sarah, that you want to add other than these?
I think building off the point you just raised, actually, in terms of, you know, not falling on deaf ears, I think the fact that this is a phenomenon that affects so many communities, I think that will help. And I think there's really a room for like a large scale partnership in this. And if, you know, our report was endorsed by, I think it was 9 community organizations, including Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, Canada Tibet Committee, and others. And if all of these groups can come together and perhaps, you know, call on their members of parliament to take up some of these recommendations, we can do like letter writing campaigns to the government. Like, I think there's quite a large group of us that sort of want to see this done, and I think that will help.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for all the information that you gave, and thanks for accepting again our invitation. And we are really proud of this partnership between Northern Justice Watch and Human Rights Action Group. And I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. And as I said, we will share the link of the report in this on our website on this page, so you can find the link of the full report of Human Rights Action Group. And so continue to watch us. And thanks again, Sarah. Bye for now.
Thanks.
Thank you.